First of all, I would like to reiterate my solidarity again and again with the vision of Hesabika in the socio-economic transformation that's based on calling us ambassadors to live and influence the spheres with right values. I also deeply appreciate the young generation in the G program, whose passion to offer their lives for godly transformation shows the courage required of God's people in his mission agenda. I recognize that God is redirecting us as believers to have, so that we can embrace the full scope of his mission. He has called us personally so that we may enjoy fellowship with him, experiencing his shalom at that personal level, as we also wait for his glorious appearance for eternity. But he has also called us to shine that light in the world. In recognition of this mission and God's word, it is important to reflect well not only how that mission looks like, but first how this world looks like, and that it is a broken world. And we need to understand this broken world, its nature, and the wide scope. It's only then that we'll apply our passion and calling in the public square with courage, with wisdom, and with compassion as well. And so I would like to share 4 things, basically 3 things, to look at the scriptures in seeing how there is expression of brokenness in the Bible, but also to look at the consequences as reflected there, but begin to see that compassion is an important component as we engage the broken world. And so I would like to share from our experiences of brokenness in the world can be overwhelming and frustrating, whether we are victims of that brokenness or we are trying to fix the brokenness that we encounter. Every generation confronted by various effects of a broken world, they always ask the question, why? And those who are trying to fix some of that brokenness are asking, how? How do we fix it? Of course, many people when they experience so much brokenness, they ask the question, where is God?
Hi, George, sorry.
I want to assume today, as I share, that we are familiar with Genesis chapter 3, that first depicts the fall of man, that is in the representation of Adam and Eve. That has been regarded as the root premier event explaining the fall of humanity. We already appreciate that with the fall, there is shame, there is fear and rejection, as both Adam and Eve try to hide from their nakedness and when they are banished from the Garden of Eden. I will not dwell on this event in my presentation. Instead, I wish to reflect on the next chapter, chapter 4, where there is a continuation of the fall, and the consequences of that fall begin to be apparent with some intensification. I'll use that story to illustrate important aspects about our broken world, looking at other texts still in the Bible and instances that show the reality of brokenness that is occasioned or associated with that human fall. So from the onset, I need to reiterate that the fall of humans persists, and it is evident across the biblical narrative. And so I want to look at that text if you have your Bibles there, but I have also shared it on the screen, and we read. Now the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth, and she said, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. And again she gave birth to his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord and the fruit of the ground. And Abel on his part also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering. But for Cain and for his offering, he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it." And Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel, your brother?" And he said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And he said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you are cast from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you cultivate the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. You shall be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth." And Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is too great to bear. Behold, thou hast driven me from the face of the ground, and from thy face I shall be hidden, and I shall be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth. And it will come about that whatever finds me will kill me." Verse 15. So the Lord said to him, "Therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold." And the Lord appointed a sign for Cain, lest anyone finding him should slay him. Now, the background of this text, the focus of this text, as we have seen, and I will keep it on the screen as I share because we have a brief time, and I would like to focus on sections of this text. The scriptures show us that, shows that despite the fall of man, beginning with Adam and Eve, life went on. And in fact, Eve confirms in this verse 1 that God granted them children after their fall. At least we see Cain and Abel named for us for the sake of the story here. Verse 3 to 5 shows us that there is even the practice of worship. In other words, the fall of man did not implode the seeking of relationship between God and his creation. God did not abandon Adam and Eve and his creation on account of the fall before, humans in particular. So the two sons of Adam, they bring offerings to God just about the same time. And for some reason, the Lord was unhappy with Cain's offering. There is a lot that has been spoken about by scholars on what was this reason. As someone has observed, perhaps the fault was internal, an attitude that is known only to God. Of course, as I've said, there are some people who think that the offering was grains rather than the animals and so on and so forth, but those are disputed. And that's not our focus here today. What we begin to see is traces of fallenness, even within the religious rituals that we have that. This leads me to my first point. The scriptures attest that there is brokenness, and this brokenness is expressed in individuals' experiences. Verse 5 and 6 says, "But for Cain and for his offering, he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. Then the Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen?'" Now we can see clearly that other than what made Cain's offering unacceptable to God, the effect of the fall is manifesting in his anger, and not just his anger, but the level of it. Because I know that anger is a reality, but there is a level that then begins to move people to think other things. In fact, verse 6, as we have read, suggests some sort of depression. It says, why has your countenance fallen? Why is your face fallen? It suggests a sort of depression that Cain is experiencing because he has received some kind of rejection for his suffering, but his brother has sacrifice has been accepted. So he is grieved, he is depressed, or he is angry. And we see this expression elsewhere in the Bible in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 8, and Jonah chapter 4, verse 9. So we begin to see brokenness expressed right in the first family. And this reminds us that as we think about engaging God's world and influencing God's world, it is important for us to remember that humans are vulnerable. They are vulnerable, not necessarily helpless, and I will talk about that. Verse 7 says, verse 7 points us to what God is telling Cain in that situation. He tells him, giving him counsel, if you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. Two things around that counsel of God. First of all, it shows us the problem and the reality of sin. It's very present. And not only that, it's crouching nature. When you think about crouching at the door, think of crouching as the inverse of sprinting. By crouching, you are sacrificing speed for the sake of accuracy. And we see, even in chapter 3 earlier, that the way that Adam and Eve were tempted was kind of crouching very subtly. And here God is presenting giving counsel to Cain and saying, look here, sin is present, and its nature is that it is crouching. And the vulnerability of humans is attested before and after this incident. And this points to the fact that from the beginning, human beings are contending with sinful urges. It is a contention between humans and forces of evil. The contention is between choosing evil and good that God is presenting to Cain. And this actually explains the inertia of human beings to do things that are always selfish or self-gratifying, even when they portend injustice to another, as we observe in Cain and Abel's story, because certainly what we have read in the story is that Cain kills his brother. But you see, even when God presents an opportunity of redemption, in that state, he is angry, his face is is depressed, or he is jealous, or aggrieved. He chooses the self-gratifying one instead. That inertia for self-gratification. There are offers that always create a blind heart and a mind, to the good and godly paths. And I mention this because this is part of our experience as we continue to pursue God's will in the society, in those spaces that He has given us. It's important there for us to recognize the reality, the presence, and the crouching nature of sin. Whereas there is the crouching sin problem, human beings are not totally helpless. Even though there was a fall at the very beginning and it continues, the gift of free will has never been taken away. And I think that's an important point. Look at God's offer of counsel in this moment of temptation, because this is a moment of temptation for Cain. It tells him, if you do this, this is what will be the result. There will be forgiveness. There will be acceptance. There is going to be the lifting of the face. There will be a reversal of these feelings so that they don't lead you beyond where you are. Or are these just rhetorical questions and a statement? This is important to note because often as believers, we exonerate non-believers from responsibility and accountability on account that they are unable to make good choices in certain areas. As we continue to seek God's, to influence God's values and God's agenda in these spheres, it is important for us to recognize, both for us believers and for non-believers, the will to choose, the will to choose good, the will to choose evil, is still with us. And sometimes we always have a theologian say that because they are unbelievers, they cannot do any good. And we exonerate responsibility and accountability. But here we see that even for Cain, that choice is there. As humans, we continue to make choices, but sometimes they are devastating choices, as we have seen. And what we see that despite the option, the free will, and the counsel of God, Cain clearly, he is giving up to the crouching sin, the lacking sin. There is a possibility, as has been shown, that he is able to overcome this evil. He is not irredeemably entangled to his parents' fallenness, and he can have a choice. So we can see that in chapter 4, despite the fall having begun in chapter 3, it is clear that the next generation is not irredeemably entangled to the first fall, and they can make a good choice. Somebody has said that Cain is not a constitutional sinner, one who is utterly depraved. He has a free choice. Yet his next action is a scheme to trap his brother, and later he kills him. And of course, as we move on, we see that that leads to more self-destruction. So the opportunity to choose good is not the privilege of Christians only. It's available to all, and that's a hopeful thing. It's a hopeful thing because as we work to seek the transformation of the society, we are going to be working not with Christians only. We are working with other people, and those are God's people. I know sometimes as Christians, we have almost caged God and he is the God of Christians, but God is the God of his people. And those people are not irredeemably entangled to make choices. And therefore, there's responsibility and accountability that's on their part. But we see from the scriptures that this is also self-destruction that is ennobling. Adam and Eve, when confronted by God, resorted to excuses and self-exoneration, if you can remember that. But Cain has gone a notch higher to indulge into violence. He is unable to restrain his resentment and bitterness, and he vents wrath on the only possible scapegoat, who is his younger brother. In fact, in verse 9, as you can see in verse 9, he rejects God's question. God is asking him, where is your brother? And he's lying about it. He's evasive about it. In fact, he is indifferent to God. So it's good to note. One of the things we need to note is that when we see institutions, and when those institutions well branded, when we see people's titles, we must remember that they are human in daily contention in making the choices between good and evil. It's not a wonder that we have policies and structures in place, but they all can only bear fruit when humans who implement those policies and who work within those structures are willing and able to contend with the alternative choices that would lead them towards either self-gratification or self-preservation, or to do good for society. The second thing to note is that imperfection prevails, and we see this imperfection across the scriptures. It's not only in the case of Cain. We see even people of faith, people like David, who is characterized, in many glorious ways. He has his moments of imperfection in the Bible. We can say that for Abraham, for Solomon, for Samson, and all that. All these men and women of God have an ambiguous characterization. Think about Apostle Peter himself. He has his moments. He is overcome by the pressure to conform to his strict Jewish roots and alienate the Gentiles. And Paul speaks about this in Galatians chapter 2, verse 11 to 4, that Peter went astray because initially when the Jews were not there, he was eating with the Gentiles. But now when the Jews come, he wants to then say he cannot be able to eat with them. So we find that there is ambiguous characterization. Christians and non-Christians, there is contention in terms of choosing what is right and what is wrong. And we see Judas, being Jesus' compassion, does not escape the culture of the love for money. So it is true that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, as we see in Romans chapter 3, verse 23. The second thing we need to look at, other than what I have shared, is just the consequences of brokenness. And these consequences of brokenness is both to the individual and to the community and even to the cultures, I would say. People are not only broken, they suffer consequences of brokenness in spaces we interact with them. As you can see in verse 11 to verse 12, God is dispensing justice for what Cain has done, and he's doing it presumably on behalf of Abel, because he says his blood is crying from the ground. And he is also punishing Cain for the offenses. Cain is cursed because of his actions. And the curse is that he's bashed from the familiar grounds and committed to hard labor in order to provide means of livelihoods. So what does he lose? His sense of belonging and identification with the community. You know, this means that the spheres that requires redemption, where we seek redemption, as I've said, they are manned by individuals in need, people who are in bondage, people who are grappling with past pains and mistakes. And I think this is important as we think about engaging with compassion, that even the very people who do evil, they are people in bondage. Their brokenness sometimes is not on the surface, but they are expressed in some ways. So brokenness is a living reality. Communities, the first human family. If you look at this text, one of the things that you do not see again as we move on is how does Adam and Eve's family look like? You know, fraternal strife is what we see here. And it has followed the trespass in chapter 3. After Adam and Eve fall, we are not told how on their own they have talked about the missteps they had before. We are not told when they went back, what chat they had as a couple, whether they were separated or divorced. It doesn't show us. But indeed, from the fact of that silence of the text, we still see emerging children. So it means they moved on together. Now, not at the center of the Garden of Eden, but on the eastern side. They are banished outside. The story continues. What is not obvious is that the effect of sin on the first family. We need to recognize that Adam and Eve may have had a share of the consequences of their fall, having disobeyed God in a territory they had not anticipated. I also need to appreciate that for Adam and the family, they have, at this point now, from this chapter, they have lost all their children. One is dead, killed by his own big brother. And the remaining one, who is the murderer child, is actually banished further away to an unknown land. And of course, with hard labor. Let's just say that one child is dead, the other child is imprisoned far and far away. So the first human family is deeply affected. The Bible is replete with the effects of sin on family and many other social setups. And this is a pattern that you can read on your own in Genesis. But sin is not only affecting the individuals and specific structures in the society, it's also affecting institutions and cultures. Sin affects communities and creates its own cultures, and we can see many of them. In fact, if you read the last verses in chapter 4 that we have just read, you will see a murderous culture developing, you know, and you see the last part of that, Cain's generation, and well depicted by a man called Lamech, shows the murderous culture that has taken root with growing impunity. In fact, Lamech is saying in one of the verses there that Cain was avenged 7 times, his will be 77 times. We see that in the Bible, there is the manipulation of policies. For example, the king's signet rings are used a lot of time to suppress people, like in the book of Esther, you see during Mordecai's time. We see cultures of biases. Christians and like Peter himself is suffering that bias, you know, a bias of ethnicity. It is so entrenched in the society, in the minds of the people, that even for Peter the apostle, and the Bible also says Barnabas also fell into that trap. The culture of bias and ethnicity, the Jews and the Gentiles, is so entrenched that it is it's a snare even to the believers. But we also see, even in the New Testament, class cultures. When Paul is writing to Philemon, we see he is tactfully pointing to a new view that Philemon should have of slaves like Onesimus, because he is now a Christian. In other words, Paul's message is really a tide against a prevailing culture of how slaves should be treated. Paul, in Titus chapter 1, verse 12, quotes a famous Cretan poet, and in quoting him, he's affirming that there is a group of people called Cretans. And what do they say about Cretans? Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, lazy gluttons. Now, that's very interesting, because sometimes you might find that there is a culture, an evil culture, that is really pervading a society that becomes a blind spot to everybody. Like, it is not only Paul that said this, he actually quoted a Cretan poet, and there are many other people who had affirmed that Cretans had made lying become habitual, it had become compulsive. So when we see then in our society certain cultures where there is a culture of greed, a breeding of corruption that demands more action, then we begin to see that there is a collective, the culture has, that kind of a culture has influenced that place. So that means that redemption in such spheres could be brought about not just by a change of individuals, but to think about narratives that would be able to change those cultures. And that's very critical. Last, as I come to the end, is to reflect on when we see the reality and the impact of sin, how do we need to respond? And we need to respond in compassion. And verse 13 to 15 is very interesting, because as it is now, naturally speaking, we should be angry with Cain, and God is indeed expending justice to him. Incidentally and ironically, he who killed his own brother now frets lest someone kill him. He doesn't want to be killed, but he has killed. And you can see how Cain is preoccupied by self. He's self-centered. He has no remorse. And besides, he's complaining about the prescribed punishment God has given him. So humanly speaking, you do not understand how God can deal with such a person in such a manner, a murderer who has killed his younger brother on grounds of envy and jealousy. But we see God expressing compassion to the offender. We have seen God have mercy on Adam and Eve and provide clothing when they are naked. And this continues in the biblical narrative where God is giving second chances to all. Now, Jesus knew the broken world needed redemption. The Bible says that God so loved the world. Even if, as some prefer this, referring to people, it is referring to broken people. It is referring to broken spaces. He loved and he came. He spent time with broken people, we know that, but he never fixed all of them. Even when he left to the Father, he was going to prepare a place where perfection would be manifested. And we need to have this in mind, because this is helping us see the beauty and hope of eternity. At the same time, it is reminding us that even when we are engaged here, we are engaged in a manner that will not necessarily bring the perfection we need. So we need to love the world, but not to hate or fight the world. And as we think about our attitude and engagement in the influence, we need to have hearts of compassion rather than hearts of fixing and hearts of hate. It sets us into a path of trust and hope in God, never limiting God's power and ability for transformation. But it also helps us to be resilient, at the same time relaxed in God's hand. It helps us not to have the Messiah complexity as we approach the transformation agenda in these spaces God has given us. It is a call to be patient. It's a call to be compassionate. It is a call to always challenge our expectations. I am reminded of John the Baptist, his expectation of Jesus. John thundered, yet he also wondered about Jesus' role in the injustice he was facing in prison himself. You wonder what is happening to Judas with silver, and Jesus knows he is in the companionship of Jesus, but he is fallen to the culture of greed that is leading him to betray Jesus. I know that as we engage these spaces, we think about those moments, the Mandela moments. But remember today, if Mandela would rise and see what's going on in South Africa, it will be really disappointing. We see that if Paul began to follow his footprints, tracing them, he would be disgusted at the state of affairs in the parts of the world he labored on and he labored for. And this calls us to the realization that we are in a broken world, attested in the text, which reminds us that the reality, the consequences of that sin demand our compassion and our walk with God. May the Lord help us as we continue to engage in these spaces, understanding that the root of brokenness has implications on how we serve him in those spaces. The Lord bless you.